Hi there. Hi. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and being a part of this evening. I am calling the meeting to order, and I will open with a thank you. Well, first of all, I'll open with our mission. AIA Brooklyn is dedicated to the advancement of the architectural profession through education, outreach, and mutual support. I want to thank, first of all, FX Collaborative for having us tonight. Very helpful to have use of this wonderful space. I want to thank David Cunningham, one of our directors, and Kelsey Kirkley, our Kelsey. What is your exact title? Yes, communications are very, these people, we put this project together, and thank you so much for your help with this. I would like to also mention that we have two vendors here tonight at tables, existing conditions. Jared Curtis from Existing Conditions is here, and we have, your name is again? Eddie from 475 Supply, and this is very appropriate because they create materials for, particularly that I know them from, for passive houses, passive house construction. So very relevant to visit these tables when we're at the end of the presentation, and in the end part of our meeting, we'll be mingling and networking and talking with each other. I'd also like to introduce you all to our new executive director, James Coster.
If you need your questions, don't pepper until Sarah's inbox is lined up and field everybody's queries. And so grab a card from me.
James is an architect himself, so he can field many questions. Letting you know that we have some committee updates. First of all, our co-chair, Michelle Todd, is the one who put this meeting together. She has, last week, she received the award for the Lucy G. Moses Preservation Award. And her project was Ridges Residence, Historic Brownstones. Congratulations yet again, Michelle, you deserve it. Next, coming up is going to be a tour of the Parsons Healthy Materials Lab on Tuesday, May 21st. Okay, well, you'll read more about these things in our e-blast that you receive every week, and it will be posted on our website when we have more information. Our Brooklyn Emerging Professionals Committee is spearheading a launch to find people interested in people who actually, Mizang, do you want to say anything about that right away? You want to launch a meeting to recruit people interested in people who are been licensed under 10 years and those who are seeking their licensing certification. Well, very quickly, we've got just a
Thank you. Very quickly, so the emerging professionals of the Brooklyn chapter kind of fizzled out during COVID. So we are trying to relaunch it, but also layer in the partnership that is needed so that it can succeed strong, so that future emerging leaders can continue the work of what the chapter stands for. So it's not just about 10 years or less licensure and associates, but that partnership is those who are established professionals. So we really want that partnership, and we want to launch it strong.
Yeah.
So more info, contact James.
and more info to follow, because things are coming up that will be, our June meeting will be about committee, we'll have a committee fair to teach members, to let members mingle and learn all about the many committees that we have in our chapter and the ones that we would like to make stronger and develop further. Events coming up. Next week's general meeting will be May 15th at City Tech nearby, and the subject will be justice, 285 J Street, Wednesday, May 15th. So right now, I'd like to bring Michelle Todd to you here. She will introduce you to our panelists that are coming up, Lindsay Wickstrom, Luna Oiwa, and Alan Solomon. Thank you. Thank you again, everybody.
Good evening, everyone. Oh yeah, come on up.
Hi there, I'm Dan. I'm the Director of Sustainability here at FX Collaborate. They wanted me to just say hello and welcome to you here. I think this is a wonderful panel tonight about, sustainability. It's something that this office has been doing since for a long time. The kind of flagship project that put this office on the map was 4 Times Square, which was considered the first sustainable high-rise in New York City back in like 1997 or something like that. And that's what brought me here. And since then, I've been able to work on many kinds of projects: passive house, towers, LEED Platinum projects. And in fact, I don't know if anybody's mentioned, this is the highest scoring LEED Platinum interior in the country that we're sitting in now. So yeah, without further ado, on with the program. Welcome.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Todd, and basically, I'm the co-chair of the code committee. So the code committee has been established for the past 2 years, and I've been really a strong advocate for us as AIA Brooklyn chapter members to really learn more about how we can do better as designers for the planet. So this one kind of took about a year to get together because we wanted the crowd, and we're going to have something in November pertaining to them. But our speakers tonight is pertaining to Earth Month, because Earth Month basically is the month of April, but Earth Month really should be all year round, and we should be really mindful of what we're doing in our part in as designers in the world. So this theme is basically about material cycle, and we have a series of really cool guests. One is Lindsay Wickstrom. She's a founder partner of Matterform. She'll be doing her presentation first. She's taught at Columbia GSAP, Cornell. She has an MArch from Columbia University, where she was awarded the Charles McKim Prize. So she basically has also I think a book, which is called Broken Nature, Making Architecture Between Nature. Sorry, everyone. You have a lot. But she's speaking, as well as Luna Oia she's an active volunteer at Building Reuse Space, and she's on the board of directors for the nonprofit Build Reuse, which is the organization that we've been trying to get for like a year to come here. So I'm really happy that you're here, Luna, to talk about the work that you guys are doing, especially with based on, you're also an active member of the New York City-based reuse network of Reclaim New York City. And then there's Alan Solomon, who's a partner of Sawkill Lumber. And he's also a co-author of Reclaim Wood, a field guide. So all of our presenters are going to basically educate us about what they do, and then how we as well in our own practices can demonstrate positive things for the planet. Thank you. So first, Lindsay will.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks. All right. Well, thank you so much for everyone coming out and seeing the three of us talk about our projects and kind of gathering together for this conversation. I'm really excited for the Q&A portion, so get your questions ready. I'm really curious to hear what you all are working on and what you think about these topics. So I'll talk a little bit about a couple of projects we do at Mataforma, and I'll also talk about my book and hopefully pique your interest in each of the projects. So one of our first projects that was finished is the Nursery at Public Records. It opened at the beginning of the summer in 2023. It was a space where we really thought about reclaimed materials, primarily as a jumping off point. There were shipping containers that were already in the abandoned lot, and we started just by thinking of those as free walls and gathering and assembling materials that were there, and then using just the smallest amount of wood to kind of cap it off. The first prompt, though, that Public Records asked us to engage in is to create a winter garden for their tropical plant collection. And so a lot of these plants were, not native. It's just interesting, beautiful plants that they have that they want to keep outside during the winter and keep them warm. So we interviewed all of them and treated them like clients, wondering what kind of temperatures do they need, what kind of comfort do they need, and used, simple grasshopper techniques to simulate how solar radiation would enter the space of the nursery. And as we started to do that, we thought, it doesn't need to be only a place for plants. It can start to become an ecosystem. So when you start to create passively heated space, that draws in other organisms too. And when you're bringing in different plants into a space, that also draws in different organisms. So we worked with Cactus Store, landscape architecture firm out of LA. This is their second project in New York City. You might recognize their first project over in Chinatown across from Seward Park, a place where they sell cactus in the winter. And so here that they worked on, they kind of verified that we can have the plants be outside in the winter. And then they also specified a couple of other plants that were designed to create the music venue that is in the center of the courtyard. And so one of those plants in particular was this Japanese black pine. And what was super interesting about this collaboration with them and also the plants that they specified is really a questioning of what does it mean to be native to New York? None of these plants grew up in New York, but all of them are very, very good at being resilient in a party. So the Japanese black pine, you can push against it. It's used to having cigarettes put out in its soil. It's very, very resilient. So is that not really very, very native to this space? It's part of the whole raving community, which would happen every Sunday, and it really thrived. And not only did it thrive with all of the humans that became part of its community, but it also welcomed birds and butterflies to kind of stop in on their migration routes. So even with this small project, we started thinking about what does it mean to design with landscapes, design with trees, design with the material of wood that are coming from particular forests. They are really interested at Public Records. I mean, first of all, they're obsessed with sourcing, obsessed. Every ingredient of every drink and every plate of food comes from a very particular place. And we were the first people to say, you can do that too with all of the things that you're building, all the materials that you use in your furniture, and the space of the nursery. So we talked to them about what kind of wood would be appropriate to use in the space, and we ended up with LVL sourced from Weyerhaeuser. And this was interesting because it was a really big company, and at first, based on my research, I was thinking, more bespoke wood is really interesting. I want to go source it from the people who grow it. You have this really intimate relationship, but usually that's really cost prohibitive. And so what we looked at was, what are the big companies that have been doing it right, or at least challenging the status quo for a long time? And Weyerhaeuser has been one of the first largest companies in the continent to create regenerative forestry practices. And so we contacted them and asked them where they grow their East Coast products. And it's actually in Virginia. So it's not only an off-the-shelf product that you can buy at Home Depot, but it's regional as well. So it's really interesting to kind of recreate those stories or assumptions that we might have that big is bad. It's not necessarily bad. You kind of have to really look into a lot of these aspects of sourcing. So at the end of the day, it turns out this space is really good for plants, it's really good for people, and it has this kind of microclimate that I'm sure we'll all get to enjoy coming in summer 2024. Another project that Metaforma, in particular I was involved in, was being commissioned by MoMA to do a speaker series called Material Worlds. And this was an effort to expand beyond how do we source wood to how do we source materials in our built environment for the future. What are the future of materials? Let's not assume that everything will be bio-based. What's the future of concrete? What's the future of steel? What's the future of the physicality of the internet? We had an episode called Silica. We did an episode on stone and earth, and we also did photosynthetics. And the beauty of this series is it's the first time that MoMA has invested in environmental research of this sort. The Ambas Institute was the institute that commissioned the speaker series, and they're the kind of first time that research like this or groups like this could get together inside of an institution like MoMA. So it was really special to include as many voices as possible. And the idea was that it should be global. And so it was over 50 people, 13 episodes. And the conclusion, or a sort of resulting question that I'd love to share with you and challenge you in your work, is to kind of stop asking this question on the left. Is this material sustainable? Sustainability is so relative. It's so relative. I would rather be asking a much more challenging, difficult question. Who is being sustained by this design, and for how long? You could argue that, not to be too dramatic, but to me it's the best example, that the project of colonialism was a sustainability project. It was sustaining a particular group of people. So if we continue to use that as a kind of generic vessel to fill any kind of definition, and we won't really push ourselves towards something that can actually be resilient for particular groups of people that have been historically disenfranchised. So all of this work in my practice started back in 2017 when I was commissioned to do 3 drawings for the Broken Nature exhibition in Milan. And the 3 drawings were called 3 Material Stories. The reason they were commissioned was because it was the first time that the supply chain of materials was drawn as an architectural drawing, putting it in our scope, saying that if we can draw this on one piece of paper and we can roll it out on a table, then all of us can get around that table and redline it. We can design it, we can have a say in whether this is the process we want to specify, this is the process we want to put money into. And so that kind of launched a lot of the way I think about design and architecture. The reason I keep working on this project is because of stats like this, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen, coming from ARC 2030, a group that I'm supported and part of, where the embodied energy of the built environment, in particular these 3 materials, is higher than all of transportation combined. That includes planes and cars and trains, just these 3 materials. I mean, we're looking outside, you can see why, right? Dense living environments, especially in places where there's so much construction happening, it's difficult to get away from these materials. And construction isn't slowing down. The amount of construction predicted by the UN in 2019 was the equivalent of all 5 boroughs of New York City being added to the planet every month. All 5 boroughs, every level of every tower being added to the planet every month. And so if we continue to build that amount, that volume of built area out of concrete, steel, and aluminum, there's an equivalent hole being dug somewhere else on the planet in order to sustain this new spot. So that version of sustainability is not equitable. You're carving out, you're ruining habitat in one place to create a sustainable habitat in the other. And in my opinion, I challenge us to think of ways that that kind of movement of material could benefit both places. If we had that idea about sustainability, I wonder what that could look like. This is why a lot of my research heads towards mass timber. This is a kind of a long walk towards my book. The book is about mass timber. It's called Designing the Forests and Other Mass Timber Futures. And every little bit of biogenic material that can replace mineral-based material in an urban environment is such a win. And here's one of many studies by Bureau Happold. Every single piece of wood can make a reduction in the embodied energy of a tower, for example. So on the right, you have an all wood building. On the left, you have an all mineral-based building. And this is another practice of Metaforma. There's no all or nothing. Every little bit counts. And just to encourage all of us to do our best when we think about sourcing and not have this all or nothing mindset. The top line, this is a graph done by Bruce King and Arup as a collaboration. The top line is concrete design. The next top line, timber design, worst case scenario. So you can imagine the day that you sit at your desk and you're thinking about all the stuff going on in your life, and you're like, oh, I just got to get through this day. I just got to specify the wood, and you just don't have time to get through a thoughtful specification. It's still better than concrete. The more thoughtful you get, the more carbon you can sequester. That's what's so incredible about our power as architects, is if we invest time in learning how to specify really well, our ability to specify really well, our knowledge in material worlds can actually have an incredible difference in the built environment. And I say that because I have so many students that feel disenfranchised or like really small in this huge world of carbon and climate change. And I just go back to this graph. There's such power in the stories we tell and the materials we specify and envision the future with. And I would hope that we all, we're okay not doing our best, knowing that it's still better than concrete, it's still better than the status quo. But if we really, really do it thoughtfully, it's an amazing impact. So this is the book that I wrote. It's called, like I said, Designing the Forest and Other Mass Timber Futures. And maybe Michelle, you gotta cut me off because I could keep talking. Okay, maybe like one more minute. Okay. So I'll maybe share just one story from the book. And the point of the book is to be a guidebook for anyone that's interested in learning how to work with mass timber. There are 4 chapters. Before I get to that example, there are 4 chapters. The introduction is kind of what I just mentioned to you. Why is this an urgent question? And then it talks about the past, present, and future. So the chapter about the past is how we got here, how much of the world has already been designed, how much of the world's forests are designed. We don't have any wilderness. That's a complete construct. All of these species that are on the planet are there because they have market value of some sort or another. So our ability to specify puts money into those forests. And that's the history of most forestry for the last 1,000 years. So that chapter, to me, researching for it was really eye-opening. What I'm proposing isn't new. It's actually very, very old. It's very pre-oil, this idea that we design forests to sustain a certain type of society. And then the second chapter is present. It's a very utilitarian chapter. What is the status of glue? What are the status of all the mass timber products? How do you specify them? What are all their thicknesses? How do they come on trucks? It's a very straightforward chapter. And then the future is thinking about how do we expand the biodiversity of that product range? Because if we keep specifying the same product over and over again, Douglas fir, because it's so beautiful and so fast and so economic, but if we keep specifying that, we're going to live in a world of Douglas fir forests, like everywhere, just monocultures everywhere. So what do we do? How do we diversify the product? I had this great question for us, especially you guys here, that launched a lot of this research. Could we build the amount of construction that happens in New York City with the forest in the state? Are there enough trees? Any guesses? Who thinks there's not enough trees? For 50 million square feet per year. There's some doubts. I see a little hand. Okay. The trees? Trees. I love it. He knows about tree migration. That's expert level. So it's so true. You got to catch them. Okay, this assumes that they're not migrating, which is a silly assumption because they are migrating. But the 50 million square feet of built area every year, I took the 3 most prolific trees in the state, and these are how many acres exist. And this is how long it takes for trees to mature. You should look at the paragraph on maturity. Maturity is also relative and can be defined by anybody. There's no facts around these things. You could say economic, reproduction, age, or maturity is determined by the sawmill size, etc. So I chose reproductive age. This is how much mass timber built area comes from each acre. this is another kind of lesson, I think, in not having an optimization mindset. We have to make space in our lives to make sure that there's still beech mass timber in there. We can't just say, oh, well, red maple makes the most, so we'll just go with red maple. And this is the same for when we think about carbon storage, carbon sequestration. We can't just think about it as an optimization, effort. We have to think about a diversity of approaches. And so at the end of the day, we can build actually even more with just those 3 species, more than 50 million square feet. So it's not a problem of the volume of trees or whether the trees are good for mass timber or whether we can physically do it. It's like, are we willing to do it? Like socially, politically, culturally, all of New York is private land. There's just these deeper challenges ahead of us when we think about a biogenic New York, let alone a biogenic cities of the future. So I hope you enjoyed the book, and let's go to the next speaker. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Luna Oiwa, and I have to admit I didn't get the memo about preparing a full presentation slide deck, so I only have a couple slides, but I just wanted to talk about how I got to this place of being a representative for reuse in the EPA. So I studied civil engineering at Cornell University, and Ithaca is where Cornell is based, Ithaca, New York. And in Ithaca, there is a reuse store called Finger Lakes Reuse, and it is a very popular store among the community there. And I bring this up because Finger Lakes Reuse used to have a deconstruction program. I don't know what the state of it is now, but basically they used to go into buildings before the building was demolished and take apart the buildings instead of having that building demolished and landfilled, so that those components could be resold and other buildings could use those components. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, and so I visited Finger Lakes Reuse and talked to the director there and just learned a little bit more about reuse of building materials as a concept. And I found it so interesting that I did some more digging into this topic and additional research about sustainable construction and what it really meant. And I wrote a paper about this topic, submitted it to the Cornell Engineering Department, won first place, and from there I posted it on LinkedIn, and then it was reshared by a board member of the nonprofit Build Reuse. And it turned out that Build Reuse was a organization, a network of individuals who were advocating for the reuse of building materials across the US. And so that was the first that I heard of Build Reuse. I started volunteering to organize their annual conference, which was virtual at the time. This was like back in 2021. And through that network, I really started to learn about the reuse space in the US. And now I am a board member of the Build Reuse organization, and I'm also the chair of the Data and Policy Committee. And through that, I graduated, and then I found a job as a lead consultant at a consulting firm called Code Green Solutions. So my job didn't really have anything to do with reuse, but I always kept it in the back of my mind because I've just found it to be a really interesting topic that I didn't hear too many people talking about outside of the build reuse space. And did that for about a year, and then I heard about another position as an embodied carbon consultant at another firm called Brightworks Sustainability. And I was really interested in that as a topic. Many of you might be familiar with the concept of embodied carbon, but it is the idea that you can track the emissions associated with building materials from resource extraction to processing and manufacturing, transportation, construction, use, replacement, end of life. etc. And the way that this tracking works is that manufacturers of building products can invest in data collection and creation of environmental product declarations, which are essentially reports of the emissions and impacts of a particular building material. And so I did, and then what you can do based on that is to um, collect these EPDs, environmental product declarations, for all the different building products in a given building, and then create what's called a whole building life cycle analysis. So you take information about the quantities of each material in a building, and then you multiply it by the carbon impact. And then you can estimate the emissions associated with the building as a whole. And so that was what I was doing at Brightworks Sustainability. But on the side, I was still volunteering for Build Reuse. And through that connection to Build Reuse, I met somebody, his name is Sean Wood, and he helped implement a reuse policy in Portland, Oregon, which I'll talk about in a bit. But he kind of pulled me into the EPA because he was there. And so that's how I ended up in the EPA. And I wanted to bring that up because the EPA currently has me and Sean as, again, people who are very interested in reuse and kind of in that space. And we were hired for that reason. And I just find it very interesting and telling that that could happen. So here on the side, I have a screenshot of the EPA website for the grant program, Reducing Embodied Greenhouse Gas Emissions for Construction Materials and Products. And this is essentially a grant program that was geared towards manufacturers who are trying to develop those EPDs that I talked about earlier, to collect emissions data for building products. And in this grant program, there is language about what types of materials the EPA is looking to fund emissions data for, and it includes concrete, asphalt, steel, glass, and then also salvage materials. So point being that the federal government is really investing right now in the decarbonization of the construction sector, and also paying attention to salvage materials as a strategy for this. And that's super important because the federal government in the US is the biggest purchaser in the world. It spends $690 billion on goods and services annually. And it is also responsible for about 30% of the total greenhouse gas emissions of the US. And so anything that the government does to try to reduce its emissions and invest in low carbon materials really makes an impact across the industry. So I mentioned Build Reuse. And again, Build Reuse is a nonprofit and national network of people working towards reusing building materials. A lot of the individuals in this group are deconstruction contractors across the US. So they're people who specialize in taking apart buildings. There's some architects, there's some people who are involved in policy, but a lot of also reuse store owners and people who are on the ground selling building materials on a day-to-day basis. But this year, for the first time in a while, because of COVID, again, the Build Reuse conference was hosted in person, and I was able to attend in Savannah, Georgia. And I noticed that it wasn't just those reuse retailers and more local people. There were also some people from Skanska and Turner and some bigger companies there as well, just because they were interested in the topic. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the past 2 years, the biggest sponsor for these Build Reuse conferences was Google, because they've actually produced a deconstruction report and are interested in this area. Build Reuse also now has a partnership with Mannington Flooring to try to create a program for the reuse and diversion of carpet and flooring materials. So I mentioned Portland, Oregon earlier because they have a policy that mandates the deconstruction of buildings, certain buildings, instead of letting them be demolished. And actually, Portland, Oregon was the first city in the country to have a deconstruction ordinance. I believe theirs was implemented in 2016, but since then, Palo Alto has developed one, and San Antonio, Texas has also developed one. Boulder, Colorado also has a deconstruction ordinance, and they kind of modeled their policy based on Portland's. And there are a number of different networks, and some of these networks are national, some of these are regional, of people, again, advocating for reuse. One of them is called All for Reuse, and this network focuses on trying to get the commercial sector to think about reuse, since it's such a different beast from trying to reuse materials for residential buildings. And they developed this map that shows all the different reuse stores across the US, and it's, from my understanding, still a work in progress, but I think it just comes to show that there is a lot of movement happening in this space and a lot of potential for growth here. And then crowd. So I kind of wanted to start broad and talk about the federal government and things happening at a national scale, and then different cities across the US. But I also wanted to talk about New York State and New York City. And as Michelle mentioned earlier, Crowd is a group of people based in Ithaca who have been meeting for the past couple of years to talk about drafting a deconstruction ordinance in the city of Ithaca. But what's unique about them is that since they are partnered with Cornell University, have also been doing some research and case studies in the area, and developing resources on how different cities can advocate for deconstruction policies. They've been collecting data on waste and I think also emissions. They have developed policy practice recommendations. They've also put together a public exhibition about deconstruction and reuse. And yeah, they're doing a lot in the space. They meet weekly, and they now have representatives from all across New York State joining their calls to talk about what can be done when everyone's in the room together. So that's Crowd, and I sit in on the Crowd meetings from time to time, but I am also part of a separate volunteer group called Reclaim New York City. And this group started in 2021, and it's a group that just meets monthly in person to talk about reuse and deconstruction in the context of New York City specifically. And right now we are developing a white paper with recommendations to New York City and related agencies and entities for how we can make reuse more widespread in this city. And those recommendations include things like having the city maybe pilot some deconstruction reuse projects, or fund space so that materials taken down from deconstruction can be stored temporarily, and then people can pick those up or transport to the next site for reuse, things like that. Right now, we're still in the drafting stage, and this proposal isn't ready to share out yet. But yeah, we have a lot of different people coming from different backgrounds in this group. Structural engineer, Alan, who will be talking next, runs a salvage lumber store. I guess I'm representing the government, but I also was an embodied carbon consultant, so I have that background. And we have somebody who worked for NYSERDA, et cetera. So it's a really interesting, diverse group. Yep. And I think that's it.
Alan Solomon is next from Sawmill.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me, AIA Brooklyn, and thanks to Lindsay and Luna for joining me here. I have a few samples here I'll pass around, and these are woods that we'll be seeing here in the slides. They're from 3 different buildings in New York City. Different eras. One is from the 1830s, one from the early 1890s, and one from 1960s that we just salvaged this week. And you can kind of note the cross grain in it and the different qualities of the wood. So as you mentioned, I'm with Sawkill Lumber. I wasn't going to kind of get into personal background, but I thought I'd touch a little bit on it. I've been involved with reclaimed wood for about 20 plus years now. I grew up in a family scrap metal business up in Boston. And growing up as a kid, you know, I take things out of the scrap. Back in the 70s and early 80s, there was a lot of great things flowing into scrap metal that you'd see in antique shops today. But I bring them down to with another kid that worked there on weekends. We took it into a flea market on the weekends, and you know, it was a great way to make a few bucks on the weekend. And we'd also had a lot of fun making up stories about the stuff that we were selling. So in some sense, I feel like I'm still salvaging things. I'm still making up stories about it in a way, but in a very different way that I'll get into here, because there's a lot of the value and the allure of reclaimed wood, the old buildings it comes from, and the stories that come out of those buildings, the very specific stories, and also the stories you make up about the buildings in your own mind. So as Luna says, we're working with Luna and a bunch of others on deconstruction policy around the city. There's a whole lot of material that comes out of buildings in New York City, as I'm sure everyone here well knows. Some of the main materials, the bulk commodity materials I like to see that you see in a lot of buildings. And here I'm talking about old buildings, like buildings from before 1940, let's say, even a little later, going back to the 1830s, is scrap metal, old brick, and antique and vintage lumber. The lumber frames almost everything. The bricks are ubiquitous, and metal has kind of been inserted at various stages along the way. There's also all sorts of oddball items, architectural fixtures and so forth that are wonderful in their own right, but are not as much of a commodity, a little hard to kind of, you know, create an ordinance around and so forth. But, you know, I think there's ways to kind of improve, you know, salvaging of those items. But the focus today is on lumber, and that's what I work with. And you know, it's a big component in the mix, and I think it's important from a carbon storage standpoint. It's important from a volume standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. You know, it's a wonderful material, and it's often hidden in the walls, hidden in the ceilings, and then it's here today and gone tomorrow when the demolition crew shows up. A lot of the old lumber in the city comes down to just a handful of trees, mostly softwood trees, almost exclusively softwood trees. I put oak there because, you know, there's just a lot of oak in buildings. these days. Just not a lot of it gets salvaged. White pine, longleaf pine, Douglas fir, and spruce. Spruce along with a whole medley of other old softwoods, but spruce seems to be the most common. And during different eras of the city's history, wood was flowing from different regions of the country. And New York seemed to always be reaching out farther and farther as the city was growing, tremendously over the years, uh, depleting whole areas. Cities in the construction of the country were just depleting whole areas and regions, and they were continuing to move into different regions. First it was the Northeast, and then after the Civil War, longleaf pine from the South was coming in as the rail networks improved. Time went on, Douglas fir and other Northwest softwoods started to flow into the city more towards mid-century. And then over time, the city continued to double back on these areas and get second growth and continue to get wood supplies. One of the samples here comes from the 1960s, came from Ottawa. There was lumber stamps on the wood, and you can really see the difference in the growth rings, in the mass of the lumber, and the difference between the old growth woods. Most of the bulk of the wood is spruce, because spruce frames like the old tenements, old apartment houses, any of these, anything from a one-story warehouse to a five-story tenement building is generally framed with spruce or hemlock, balsam fir, white pine. It all started to get mixed together. White pine, Douglas fir is fairly common, and longleaf pine is relatively common too. It frames the warehouses, old warehouses, factories, and so forth. Tribeca, Lower Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn and Queens, you tend to find a lot of longleaf pine. This is a typical kind of salvage situation down in Chinatown about 5-6 months ago. There was a tragedy at this building, and then they had to stop and they renewed it. But it's physically intense, hazardous work to salvage the wood, and it comes out of the buildings in much the same way that it went in the buildings. People carrying the beams by hand, lowering them by hoists. One of the really extraordinary qualities about the wood of New York City is that a lot of it is old growth. It's sourced from the original forests, virgin forest of the United States. So in some sense, it's kind of the largest old growth forest in the country by some sense. And so the image on the left is old growth forest as they existed prior to the original European settlers arriving, and this is the state of the old growth forest today. So, a lot of that wood now, reemerges at demolition sites. This is the first of two projects I'll talk a little bit more about. This was last week, and this was a 1960s building in Brooklyn on McDonald Avenue. It was very difficult to get this material salvaged because it's a very undesirable quality of wood. It's naily, it had metal attachments. It was dismantled with excavators, which meant, there was a lot of damage to the wood. So ultimately, this wood ended up going to Montana. And that's a whole other issue, but a lot of wood from New York City gets exported. Some of it goes, there was a building in Manhattan, 1 million board feet went to Japan. So, it's getting reclaimed, but, obviously there's a slightly higher carbon footprint sending it 2,500 miles across the country or across the globe or so forth. But um, so they'll go to Montana, it'll get cut up for paneling, maybe for, a nice ski home, on the mountain. And the the new owners may or may not know that they're looking at a New York City window company on their walls, but you know, it's rustic, and um, now I threw these numbers up here just to kind of get a sense of, a lot of times reclamation comes down to, to the bottom line and whether it's viable and feasible to do it. So, for me personally, it was, it's kind of a stretch to make a project like this viable. The trailer fit about 12,000 board feet. There's a waste factor. To get $2,500 for the load, we have to give the demo guy $1,000, and not many demo guys are going to take $1,000 for it. This was a good one that would do the work. It still worked out for him, but usually they're thinking about jumping on the next project, or it's not factored into their estimates, or even if they're making money, it can be hard to kind of get the wheels in motion to salvage the material. So I paid the contractor $1,000. There were $500 in expenses. Sometimes there's unknown expenses come up. This trailer took a day and a half to load. It's, I think, a record for loading trailers. And so I make $1,000, but there was also 2 site visits to go out there, 2 days spent on the job. For the demo contractor, they make $2,700. They save disposal costs. They have to pay out something in labor. They probably would have people there anyways, so maybe they even can net more, and they make $1,000 from the wood. So even on a really difficult project, it shows that demo people can make money off of salvaging wood. So this ordinance we're working on, in the city, is something that really benefits demolition contractors, but the culture and the protocols and the way people work, make it very difficult to kind of sometimes get this material salvaged. Volumes is a lot of different factors. This is another project. This is the 1832 house, East and White Pine. They wanted to salvage this wood and actually get it remilled and put back into the house. So this is really a great kind of reuse of material coming out of the house. The big problem is 1832, there's been a lot of nails put through the face of the wood. So it's, a little of it could get salvaged, but it's really hard, to remill a board that has literally 80 nails from different generations, stapled into the face of the board. So that's 248 Waverly. And so nails are generally an obstacle, but there were a lot of challenges in trying to reclaim wood. There's higher remanufacturing costs. And I'm sure Lindsay can talk to this and how less efficient it is to remanufacture old lumber than taking logs out of the forest. There's the variability in the material. There's this whole idea of undesirable species, which, I'd be interested. I'm always fascinated to hear architects' comments on their experience using reclaimed wood, their apprehensions about it, their perceptions about the material. There are demo site restrictions. There's lack of an ordinance. But I feel like the benefits of reclaimed wood really eclipse. I guess that's the word in the month. Eclipse. But the beauty of the material of reclaimed wood. Some people see this. It's very versatile material. This happens to be a passive house in Park Slope South. Here they also had some of their white pine remanufactured to go back into their home. And there's, of course, sustainability of the material, which is a whole interesting conversation. I mean, in the scope of all the wood used in the world, I don't think reclaimed wood would even like be visually on the pie chart. You'd even be able to see the line that represents, how much reclaimed wood there is. But I do feel like it has value as like in a lot of ways. It's a symbolic resource in a sense. For New York City, it's a great material to live with, and it also has all these qualities that don't meet the eye. Like in this case, the lab up in Columbia, we cut samples for them, and they do dendrochronology on the wood because they're able to reach farther back in time with old wood than they can with trees today, and they're able to feed that climate information they get into their models, and a lot of what they've discovered helps to validate climate change. And New York City is a unique resource of these old woods. This was one of their first projects. It's called the Terminal Warehouse. You may be familiar with it on 11th Avenue. And they were able to date the trees back to the building's construction, but more remarkably, they found the location where the trees grew just from the kind of fingerprint of the growth rings. And that was this Chocolaca Mountain region in Alabama, in Georgia. Then from there, we even found like the timber company that probably harvested it and so forth. This is the last slide. And David mentioned when he invited me to come here and speak, that I could talk on anything, I guess. And, one thought was I could probably just read sections of this book, and that would be fine. And one thing about this book is that it's not just a great book, but in some ways it's a tour of New York City from the inside out. Because Henry David Thoreau, in the 1840s, he had this notion that he was looking at the wood in his house and he wanted to know where it grew. And so he went up to Maine with a Native American guide and a companion, and they penetrated into the up the Penobscot River and in search of the pine. And he documented all of this in his book. And he talks a lot about logging. He talks about the natural landscape and so forth. And it's a picture of where these woods came from in the 1830s, and a picture in the sense of where a lot of wood from New York City that frames New York City came from. But unfortunately, in the end, he never finds the white pine because the logging companies have already gotten to it. White pine grows in kind of groves, and oftentimes the groves were kind of marked out and cut down first. So we basically have the benefit of actually looking at the white pine that didn't reach him, because this board in many respects may have come from the same forest as it came out of Bangor into the port of New York back in the era. That's about it. A sawkill is a Dutch term. It means Sawmill Creek. And it was the site of one of the earliest sawmills on the island of Manhattan back in the 1630s that the Dutch built. But it's also a hope that we can maybe return somehow to those net zero environments, but somehow do it in this high-tech way that we're all working on together. Thank you.
So this is great. This is fantastic presentations. Thank you, all of you. And this is now our Q&A period. We have 2 microphones, and we can share them. One for the speakers. If you could come up and sit here at the desk. Thank you, James. You could turn it on with help. Does anybody?
How about now?
You'll find out. There you go.
Thank you all for your presentations. They highlight the problematic, I think, is the best way to put it. And I think that the place to start is in comparing the last speaker's map of the United States, showing all of the forests of this country that were used, that existed at the time we used to build New York, with the first speaker's discussion on the supposed sustainability of going from concrete to wood. Obviously, that wouldn't come from the United States, as it's already disappeared, so it might come from places as the Amazon or other forests in the world. And frankly, I find it very difficult to make the argument that going to build with wood without questioning what's built is sustainable at all. I think it's a high road to destruction.
It's a great point. So I think the proposal at the end, which I went through really quickly, of using trees that are grown in New York State to build buildings in New York City, is an idea about locally sourced mass timber. And when we look at the volume of, so New York State has the highest biomass out of any state in the country. And when we look at all of the species that grow here and the volume that's growing at a particular rate, what that study showed, it was a white paper that was sponsored by the UN Environment on biodiverse mass timber. What that study showed is that it's possible to build with locally sourced wood all of the construction that New York City currently conducts from the state without ever depleting the forest. The amazing thing about forests is that they regrow. The thing that, so the proposal is not to source from the Amazon. The Amazon is actually a very poor source of timber. Amazon is mostly burned down for beef production. So I think it's much more of an agricultural problem in the Amazon. But the idea of sourcing locally in a state to build with mass timber in the cities is an initiative that is shared by many states. So like Portland, Oregon, great example. They're looking at a lot of regional sourcing as well, not only in Oregon, but also directly related to Canada. So the proposal is that we can source locally.
How long does it take for the regrowth of the stock? Obviously, you can tell that trees differ in strength and usability, applicability for construction by how old they are, meaning how dense they are internally.
It's a really great question. So one of the challenges with existing lumber supply chains today is that we rely on fast growth pine. And a lot of that lumber that you go to see at Home Depot is like 20-year growth. And it makes people a lot of money. So the proposal is that when you're starting to do regenerative sustainable forestry, also words that we should question, but that's the term. If you were to Google like regenerative sustainable forestry, the idea is that you can use like biodiverse forests and harvest different species at different times as they come online maturely. The way that you set maturity is so complicated though, because if you start to say, I didn't want to get super nerdy on you guys, but you brought it up. Like say like beech tree maturity, beeches could grow for so long, so long, hundreds of years. And if we were setting maturity based on natural reproductive maturity, like when does a beech drop its seeds, it would be like 200 years we would be waiting. That is not the normal way that regenerative sustainable forestry dictates maturity. It's typically economic maturity, so the diameter breast height, so the thickness of a trunk that would fit in a sawmill. And I've spoken as like one of the keynote speakers at Wood Solutions like annual summits on this issue, and people come up to me at the end and want to redesign their sawmills to be more appropriately sized for natural reproduction in the forest. So this is a tension with what we need as humans and what the forest wants to do. But since, going to Alan's amazing map, there's a lot of, I think, terms that I think we should question, like virgin forest. There's a history of indigenous cultivation long before settlers arrived. In fact, like 200 years before the 1620s, one of the first scouts that arrived in North America saw great, vast parks. That was the phrase that was logged in the diary, not dense forests. But what happened was, over the course of 200 years, all of the indigenous people died from disease. The forest was no longer being cultivated and grew back into what looked like an amazing wilderness that was untouched. But it was highly cultivated for thousands of years. So this idea that the forest is this untouched thing is not true. But the idea that we can design the forest to be not depleted and design our societies to not be depleting them at the same time is what the societies of the past would do. So you wouldn't, when settlers arrived, there was a lot of, like Alan mentioned, it's like clear cutting. That's just depleting, and you have to go further and further and further, and you've clear cut everything. And we're finally retracting that way of working. So like Weyerhaeuser, like I mentioned, they were the first Western, I guess American group to say, you know what, we shouldn't clear cut anymore. We should regrow. And it's an economic choice too. I mean, they were losing tons of money not regrowing. So most timber companies in the US today, standard practice is to replant, regrow everything. In fact, the whole country, in this room, we couldn't buy enough wood to actually reduce the net growth happening. There's so much growth happening. The market can't even put a dent in how many trees grow in this country. It's so intense. So there's a lot of, I think, I guess it's very complex. What I argue for is that a robust timber market that has biodiverse products actually puts money into forests that would otherwise be very poor. And a poor forest burns. And that's what we're seeing on the West Coast. And so if we can increase the timber market, it's actually saving the forest of this country in an unintuitive way.
Wonderful presentations, thank you. Are you all familiar with there's a New York State bill that's promoting deconstruction? And specifically, it's called the
Is it the one about
deconstruction.
salvage lumber?
Yes, and it seems to say that it kind of implies that there's some problem with grading wood, and it says that there needs to be standards about grading wood so that we can all use it. If you know anything about that, can you elaborate?
I don't know a ton about it. I do know that it's a bill that makes it easier or makes it possible to use structural wood or salvage structural wood in construction projects. Do you know any additional information?
No, I just know any architect that's acquired some reclaimed wood to like sister joists or try to use them, it's the last time that they're doing it.
I actually have a follow-up to that. So how would we even specify or write a specification that permits the use of reclaimed woods, or as opposed to even encourages the use of reclaimed woods, where like most specs are like, newest, best quality, the stuff that we inherit from spec writers tends to be not aiming toward reclaimed wood of any kind. So, I mean, is there a way that we can, how do we specify to actually get that material in a building?
I think that's what this bill is aiming to address. but I'm not a structural engineer, so I don't know the details of that either, unfortunately.
Concept where we are going to have a property which is consistent all along for one project. Why? Right now, mass timber is still too new to have reclaimed mass timber. So you are talking about dimensional lumber, reclaimed dimensional lumber, which by essence is not consistent. So it's always oversized, contrary to mass timber. And so that's why there will be more margin we can reclaim actually pretty easily the dimensional lumber because it's oversized. So we are not going to be so precise about the technical properties of each element. And yes, what I had a question as well. So I'm Vincent Albrecht. We are co-founder of Oulipo Architecture Studio, specialized in mass timber architecture. And we have tried so much to reclaim material here, and it's just an, how do you say that, obstacle course. Like it's, even if you have the will, the client has the will, and we even have the will to pay more to be able to reclaim material, we just cannot. So what happened in New York, in Europe a while ago, and I think it began in Belgium with Rotor, which is a pioneer of this logistic of like reusing material. And they had the Belgium pavilion in 2014, I think, at the Biennale di Venezia. And this was a big deal. Like everyone understood in Europe that that was a game changer. So 10 years ago. And they were the pioneer. I know someone in France who was totally, it was a turning point for her, this exhibition at the Biennale. And she was a big architect in France, and she was like, if I want to have a real impact on the future, it's not by being an architect, but by putting in place this structure to be able to reclaim materials, because the biggest problem for reclaiming materials or reusing materials is the storage. So you need, like, it's definitely the big challenge of that. So you need a structure which, ahead of any deconstruction, is able to, a logistic which is able to list all the elements which will be available at that date. So a future, like to be proactive, a future construction can use these listings, and to, even in the design, at the time of the design, so even not pre-design, but like DD, you can already adapt the design with what is available. And this is a big game changer. So what she did in France, she even changed the law. Before we had a law of like having a diagnosis of demolition. Now we have a law, she really like put a lot of lobby on the deputies, and she actually won the war. Like now we need to have a diagnostic of reusable elements of any deconstruction. And so this is entered, each element is entered in this like software, and which is available ahead of demolition for new construction. So in the US, I was like, great, let's use that. And I talked with you on a webinar, and I asked you, like, do you have any map or where and which material is available and where? Like a very simple map. And you sent me this map that we showed on the screen, which is only the stores. We called all the stores of the state. It was in California. All the stores of the state saying we need that. And they were almost laughing, saying, okay, guys, just call us every day and we will tell you if at one point we have something. I'm like, you don't have even an Excel sheet where you put what people need, and then it make an alert very simply when the thing is available. They didn't even have that. And all the organizations are separated. There is no centralization of any kind. And so in the end, the client was like, I'm sorry, but just I'm done with that. We spent so much time trying to reclaim, and it was impossible. So I really think, and so this woman who opened this structure in French, which is called Raedificare, is opening it in Canada too now. So it's closer to the US, and at some point, I hope that in the US we will have this, I think, pretty simple logistic, except that Belgium, France is a very small country, So when you have one person really leading the game, you can get to somewhere. I know that here it's a huge country with many states and it's more complex, but what is great with build reuse is that you are in every state. So you can really centralize that, I guess, and maybe having like each organization which is separated and small entities like that, maybe work together toward a common goal. Like this would be fantastic. Because again, I know that the client was like, we are going to pay to remove the nails, etc. And this is one of the big problems are the nails. And now there is machines for that. I don't know if you saw, like there was a lecture recently about this woman who find a way to remove the nails more easily, etc. So there is really some progress on that. So at some point, it won't be such a barrier. The barrier remains the cost, weirdly. It's more expensive than just having new wood, depending, of course, of the context. Of course, it depends on the availability of the wood. But people are really willing to even pay more, but they cannot do it. So it's, yeah, I think we should really get into that. Thank you.
Yeah, have you also looked into Reaply as a company? It's a growing software company that is working across the U.S. to have people post materials onto their platform and then match people who are. It's called Reaply, RHEAPLY. Reaply, yeah. Reaply. Yeah, we can also chat after this.
It's like double punishment. Like, don't reclaim it, and plus you have all this. Even if it's for nothing, like just keep the wood inside so it doesn't decompose, even if it's not, it's totally useless. But you put the wood in your house and you just keep it like.
Luna, I have a question regarding these cities that have introduced these ordinances to deconstruct and salvage buildings. What criteria do they put on this? How much of the building? How do they determine what building type is right and all of that? And does it apply to every building across the city? I imagine that there's some buildings that you can't just go ripping out floor joists without providing temporary structural support in other ways, so the whole thing doesn't fall down. How do they handle that?
Right. So the way it differs from city to city, but the way that Portland, Oregon, for example, handles this is that they had a cutoff date. So initially they said all buildings that were torn down that were built in before 1916, I believe, would have to be deconstructed. I think it only applied to residential buildings also. And that was so that the materials that were deconstructed wouldn't flood the market, I guess, and wouldn't overwhelm the deconstruction contractors and the retailers in the area. And the reason they chose 1916 was because these older buildings have old growth wood. And so their wood is more valuable, and also because they kind of split the building stock and figured out that 1/3 of the buildings stock, or I think 1/3 is made up of buildings that are 1916 and earlier, and then they moved that up to 1940 to capture 2/3 of the market. And I don't think that there is a percentage that they're required to meet, but the idea is that for a lot of these deconstruction ordinances, there is a fee that's paid before the permit process, and a waste diversion plan that's submitted. And after the deconstruction takes place, that plan is compared to what's actually taken down. And then based on that, the deposit is returned.
I have a question. You were saying about how Google was one of the big supporters of it, and then you noticed that there were a lot of other large construction companies down there as well. Is there some kind of incentive for them such as like a carbon tax or something, if they're being more mindful about this practice of deconstruction?
I don't think it's a carbon tax. I think it's that they're interested in sustainability as a story, and they really want to show that they're leaders in the space. So going beyond, for example, LEED certification, they really want to, since circularity and reuse is something that's still relatively niche, incorporate that into their sustainability message.
Okay, so there's no economic advantage for them at this point.
At this point, I don't think so.
Okay, and then, but Alan, how do you find these places? How do you find these places to take to deconstruct? Do the owners call you to say, hey, I have a house, I want you to take my wood? Like, do you have clients that are really mindful about, oh, I don't want this to go into a landfill, I want it to be reused somewhere else?
It's mostly the demo contractor that mostly the demolition contractor that you reach out to. There's a lot of demolition contractors in the city, but there's actually a handful of demolition companies that demolish the bulk of buildings in the city, because you need to be set up with machinery and labor and understand the permitting and so forth. So it's actually reduced to relatively few.
But if they reach out to you, or you reach out to them?
Both. I'm able to get some lumber, but a lot of it, there's a lot of people looking to pull lumber out of New York City because they see it as this, huge repository of old lumber. So you get, companies from all over the country that call in, looking for lumber. And, as long as you can fill a tractor trailer, then usually the costs are, like workable.
There is the facts regarding, so most of the states like beginning to talk about carbon are focusing on operational carbon. And the embodied carbon is really left behind because right now we had like 11% of the global emissions were embodied carbon. But this is coming to 50-50 very soon because there is so much effort on the operational carbon. Also, there is a lot of new construction which hopefully, obviously on the first years of a building, it's the embodied carbon which is preponderant compared to operational carbon. So the only regulations that we have are about embodied carbon are beginning to be implemented in progressive jurisdiction like California and Colorado. Only 2 states. But there is more and more incentives, not tax, but at least incentives to push toward less embodied carbon. But that's true that unfortunately the operational carbon, I have taken the whole focus on everyone, unfortunately.
I want to add to that. I think it's a really good point. Usually in my longer talk, I'll talk about how operational energy trends with capital. So the more energy you save, the more money you save. So it's an easy win. But typically embodied energy trends against capital. So the more embodied energy you save, the more expensive things get. And the more fossil fuels you emit, cheaper things get. And so that's the major challenge ahead of us. And so it's really amazing to hear about how reuse can start to be fit into stories. Alan, you brought up this great point too. Storytelling and framing this as a new version of sustainability, like reclaiming and looking at what's there first is so critical for the future.
If anyone has one more question, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. It was touched on a little bit earlier that, one sort of unfortunate aspect of, I think, what we're talking about with this deconstruction is that you're sort of down cycling, particularly with, old growth structural wood, if you end up using it for paneling and so on. So I'd love to hear it if anybody could sort of correct that impression, if there are some opportunities maybe with sort of either through regulation or more sophisticated markets to handle this material. that where we could avoid some of that downside. Um, but my broader question to the group view a little bit is, it's very interesting to focus a little bit on New York City. But as I think your first president alluded to, a lot of the construction is happening in other parts of the world. And so I'm wondering how these sort of more advanced economies, like in the United States and Europe, whether there are any kind of efforts to translate some of what we're learning to what's happening in other parts of the world.
Oh yeah, we were before we got started. I'm not an expert in this at all, but maybe there's experts in the group in the crowd that we can talk to afterwards. But Europe has a lot of circularity goals, like much more advanced than the United States. And the way that they measure it could be of interest. The percentage of circularity that's in the built environment is incentivized economically. So there's a much more robust infrastructure. I mean, it's still a work in progress. So I think those examples, they're leading the way in a sense. And so hopefully maybe that's what California and Colorado have started to adopt, those ways of thinking about policy. I think when it comes to mass timber, it's probably really similar to structural lumber reuse. One of the biggest challenges is that every jurisdiction has to be individually brought on board with the update. And so that's a huge lift. That's a big, when you go to these big wood conferences, that's like the main hurdle everyone talks about, that and building insurance. And so you have the fire marshal, the insurance companies, those are the big gates towards fully biogenic reuse world. And that's more of a people challenge. You know, you have folks that are really worried about wood burning, no matter how many studies or tests are done to show that mass timber is just as safe as steel and concrete. People don't like it because they think it burns. And so a fire marshal might not go forward with that policy. Similar to, I would assume, reuse, but I'll let you guys correct me if I'm wrong. It's old. We don't know if it's cracked. We don't have the technology to prove it. Building's not going to be insured. So there's just a lot of, there's a gap there between, insuring or like the using technology to ensure the performance of this new material or old material, to give everyone confidence in the building department and in the financing world. But I know, the city of New York is making great strides on working with the DOB you can talk to Gazem, second row, on bringing everybody along on that path, because it really does take a lot of relearning. I mean, it's also expensive to retrain everybody in the building department on new materials. So it's a big lift. It's amazing that we're really going through that.
We do have to wrap up right about now. Anything else to say? Could you say quickly?
So regarding the downcycling question, I think that ties back to what was discussed with the bill on structural lumber and making it possible to use salvage lumber in a construction project. And I don't have a ton of information on that, but there's that aspect of trying to reuse as structural materials. I also know of an example in Colorado, in Boulder, where steel beams were taken out of a hospital building and are now, there's a project that's trying to reuse that steel for other projects. And so they are rare, but there are instances of this being kind of piloted and in the US. I also know that MIT has a lab that is researching steel and the ability to reuse structural steel in new projects. And then regarding international projects, I've heard of an interesting study called the Buildings as Material Banks, and it's essentially this project in Europe where a building has been designed to be taken apart and then put back up and then taken back down multiple times to serve different functions. And that kind of research, I don't know how much it's being commercialized over there, but I think the technology side of reuse can be applied between Europe and here, because I mean physics works the same between there and here, and even if building codes don't.
So far.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again. This has been a wonderful program. We have one more thing. Jared, you want to give a pitch about Existing Conditions? Existing Conditions is a 3-day survey company. And when we conclude with this, we will continue our conversation fairly quickly and eat the remaining food and say hello and exchange cards, say goodbye and exchange cards or somewhere.
I'll keep this really brief, but great to see a lot of familiar faces and meet some new folks as well. I'm from Existing Conditions. We 3D laser scan and measure buildings and then produce accurate drawings and 3D models to architects' specifications within your templates, so that whether you're working on a renovation or bringing us in for an ongoing construction project, you have accurate documentation of what's really there, as opposed to the old blueprints from 1936 or nothing, which is often the case. So we help eliminate a lot of unpleasantness of working off of inaccurate drawings for your schematic design in particular. Our company has a lot of former architects or recovering architects on our team, so we know a lot of the pain points, and I can tell you about our 12-step program as well. And then, yeah, we're a member of a lot of AIA chapters here in the city, and we love AIA Brooklyn. So you'll definitely see us at lots of events. It's great to be a part of the chapter. And then lastly, just a short plug, we are launching this year's iteration of what we call our Innovation Challenge, which is geared towards students in architecture design programs throughout the city. And there's a large cash prize and internship opportunities. The winner of last year's Innovation Challenge, Nick Mateus, is an architecture student at Pratt, and he's here. And I know a lot of folks are involved in teaching and different schools to various capacities. So if you'd like some of your students or friends who teach at architecture design programs in the city to pass along that opportunity to their students, would love to tell you more about that, or give you a pamphlet that you could pass on to them. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you. We just have we're here, we do need to be out of here by 8:30, so please continue the conversation to a certain extent. Thank you again.